Speaking of which, let me begin. Good afternoon, and I want to welcome everyone to Comics in the Classroom, the first of what we hope will be many enjoyable and helpful professional development events. This event has been made possible by the generous funding of the San Francisco State University College of Liberal and Creative Arts through the Extraordinary Ideas Grant Program. That's what it's officially called, with additional funding from our Dean's Office. Please note that the event is being recorded, so please don't feel compelled to try to keep up with the chat. It'll all be available, and I'll share the link with everyone probably sometime tomorrow. I'm Jim Gilligan. I'm an associate professor of English education at San Francisco State, and I, along with Nikhil Laud of San Francisco Unified School District, will be your host and moderator for today's panel discussion and Q&A. Nikhil?
Greetings, folks. My name is Nikhil Laud, and I work on the History, Social Studies, and Ethnic Studies team for San Francisco Unified School District. I'm here along with Terica Garcia and other folks on our team. And we know, particularly for teachers, but really for all folks who are here, that that everyone is at capacity, at least particularly in education and in our classrooms. We just want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for making some time to join us in what we think is going to be a super engaging, important conversation around narratives, around comics, around the teaching of narratives for our students. I wanted to frame why our history and social studies team, and also in libraries, why we've invited particularly so many SFUSD educators here today. And I'm going to do so just by sharing a couple words, if I could, from A Talk to Teachers, which is a speech by James Baldwin. He writes, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another very aware of that." Right? He says, "The purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for themselves, to make their own decisions, to ask questions of the universe, and then learn to live with those questions. That's the way our students achieve their own identity. So the obligation of anyone who thinks of themselves as responsible is to examine society and try to change it. That is the only hope society has." We think that that's really important because in SFUSD History Social Studies, we are trying to center inquiry, critical thinking, and informed action. And we could think of no better ways to do that than to think about the kinds of texts that are relevant and are engaging to our students, to think about the ways in which these texts are contested, and why it's important for students ultimately to examine those texts to create their own. And so we are really grateful for the opportunity to hear from such an esteemed panel and be able to ask our own questions at the end for panelists around connections to our own classrooms. What we will be doing through the sign-in form that Terica is sharing graciously is, please, if you're an SFUSD educator, use that form. We have gotten texts from the authors that are on our panel today, and we want to send them to you. So please fill out the form. Oh yeah, there does seem to be a little bit of feedback. So please mute if you're not speaking. If you could please fill out the form that Terica is sending out, one for extended hours, but for two, so we can have record of you, and we want to send you the text that these amazing authors have created for us to get them into your hands and eventually into students' hands. So with that, Jim, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks. I'd like to start by introducing the other members of our SFUSD, our SFSU team. I kind of get mixed up with all these acronyms sometimes. Trevor Getz, who is kind of hovering in the background, he'll be monitoring the chat. He's a professor of history at SFSU, and Nick Sousanis, an associate professor of humanities and liberal studies, in charge of our comic studies minor here at SFSU, and he is also an Eisner-winning comics author and educator. Our esteemed panel today includes Maya Kobabe, Maya is a non-binary queer trans author, a voracious reader, a K-pop fan, and a daydreamer. Maya's pronouns are em and er. You can learn an astonishing number of intimate details about em in Genderqueer, a memoir, and in her other short comics published by The New Yorker, The Nib, The Washington Post, and in many print anthologies. Genderqueer won a Stonewall Honor and an Alex Award from the American Library Association in 2020. It was also the #1 most challenged book in the United States in 2021. Welcome, Maya. The next member of our panel is Joel Christian Gill. Joel is a cartoonist and historian who speaks nationally on the importance of sharing stories. He's the author of the acclaimed memoir, Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, cited as one of the best graphic novels of 2020 by the New York Times, and for which he was awarded the 2021 Cartoonist Studio Prize. He wrote the words and drew the pictures for Fast Enough, Bessie Stringfield's First Ride, and the award-winning graphic novel series, Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, as well as 3 volumes of Tales of the Talented Tenth, which tell the stories of Bass Reeves, Bessie Stringfield, and Robert Smalls. He is currently at work on the graphic novel of Ibram Kendi's National Book Award-winning Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, forthcoming from 10 Speed Press in 2023, just a few months from now. Yes, Joel? Gill has dedicated his life to creating stories to build connections with readers through empathy, compassion, and ultimately humanity. He received his MFA from Boston University and his BA from Roanoke College. Welcome, Joel. Third member of our panel is Mari Naomi, whose pronouns are they, them. Mari is the award-winning author and illustrator of Kiss and Tell, a romantic resume, ages 0 to 22, Dragon's Breath and Other True Stories, Turning Japanese, I Thought You Hated Me, the Life on Earth trilogy, Dirty Produce, and the upcoming Collage Comics memoir, I Thought You Loved Me. Their work has appeared in over 80 print publications and has been featured on websites such as The New Yorker's Daily Shouts, The Washington Post, LA Times, The Rumpus, LA Review of Books, Midnight Breakfast, and BuzzFeed. Their comics have been translated into French and Russian. Mari Naomi's comics and paintings have been featured in the Smithsonian, the De Young Museum, the Cartoon Art Museum, the Asian Art Museum, and the Japanese American Museum. In 2011 and 2018, Mari toured with the literary roadshow Sister Spit. They are the founder and administrator of the Cartoonists of Color database, the Queer Cartoonists database, and the Disabled Cartoonists database. They have taught classes for the California College of the Arts Comics MFA program, and they were a guest editor for Penn Illustrated. They were co-host of the Ask Bi Girls podcast with author Miriam Gerba. Mari Naomi lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with their partner and a menagerie of beloved rescue animals, one of whom is sharing the screen with her right now. Welcome, Mari.
Thank you so much.
And last but certainly not least, Joe Schmidt. Joe is the Senior Instructional Specialist in Social Studies at the New York City Department of Education, my hometown. He has been a huge proponent of the integration of comics into the social studies curriculum, including the new Passport to Social Studies program and the Hidden Voices curricula. Joe was awarded the 2021 American Historical Association's Beveridge Family Teaching Prize. Welcome, Joe. Now, Nick will start our gathering by saying a little bit about the Comic Studies program here at SF State, and then by sharing with us a brief history on the censorship of comics. We will then begin the panel discussion. Each panelist will have approximately 10 minutes to introduce their work, share insights about their individual process, perhaps discuss a particular page from their work, and then discuss experiences having their work banned in schools and or libraries. Joe will also talk about how New York City public schools are utilizing comics in teaching and learning. Following the panel discussion, we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Please note that the chat function is also available, and we're scheduled to wrap up around 5:15. So Nick, if you'd get us started.
Sure. Is that showing through?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. And brief is the key for what I'm going to do. I just thanks Jim and Trevor and the college and the dean's office and SFUSD and our panelists. I'm so excited to see you, even though I don't really get to see you. And I want to ask questions, but I'm just going to listen. But I will say we have a comic studies program at SF State, started just after I got here. And my slides are moving here. We study the making of comic. We study comics, how they do things. We study things like our conversation today. We talk about making of comics, and we talk about the uses of comics. And on that note, we are about to launch a certificate in creative nonfiction comics making. So we're gonna put our makers to work to do things for the university. So those are things we do in the program. We've hosted events. This is our second Comics in the Classroom thing. It was all on Zoom last time, 2 years ago. And we've also been doing this events around comics and blind low vision readers, comics and accessibility with our Longmore Institute for Disabilities here. We have a collection here that's pretty interesting, that includes Superman #1 without a cover, but it's there. And I don't want to say too much, but we do a lot in our classes of play and a lot of study, and try to see that study and play are kind of the same thing. And students draw, and students who come to us who've never drawn, and students who've drawn a lot, and they end up making comics. And they think about how to analyze comics, how to take them apart. Oops, I'm clicking funny here. And some of them come out who have amazing skills and do amazing things, and some of them who've never drawn do amazingly powerful things. And it's really a treat to be part of this. So ask me questions about it sometime. But I'm not going to say a lot about censorship, but a little brief history I think is worth it for those of you who have known nothing about this part. And the main thing, which the cartoonists here will all know a lot about this, some of you probably more than I do for sure, is this book, Seduction of the Innocent by psychiatrist Frederick Wortham. A text that's been pretty much torn apart and disproved, maybe most prominently by David Hayju's The 10-Cent Plague, and more recently by Carol Tilley's work debunking his work. But it had an enormous impact on the publication of comics, despite the fact that he kind of made it up because he just felt like comics were corrupting youth. This is from David Hayju's book. Wortham conducted no scientific investigation. So he had feelings that comics must be the things that were corrupting our youth, and went out to campaign that was the case. He wrote here, I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. So just a little bit of the hyperbole. And he didn't start this. Ladies' Home Journal in 1909, in an article called A Crime Against Children. This is all from David Hayju's book. Are we parents criminally negligent of our children, or is it that we have not put our minds on the subject of continuing to allow them to be injured by the inane and vulgar comic supplement of the Sunday newspaper? Nothing short of a national crime against our children. In this article, they called A National Disgrace, badly drawn, badly written, and badly printed. They're often really tearing up comics coloring through a lot of these articles. And this led in the 50s to comic book burnings around the country. Some led by parents, some even led by kids, but burning comic books all around the country. And it's interesting to me, I show this to students and I say, surely this is, a sign of a past time. And then an article about one of our panelists or someone else book being banned that exact day comes out, and they say, we're not done with this yet. The comic book industry, sort of under a lot of pressure, responded by self-censoring with this Comics Code Authority. which I want to end with this is, like I said, super brief, where you see the change of a Batman comic from 1939, which is all dark and scary, and to a Batman comic and must be after 54, where Batman turns into Bat Baby. So self-censorship turned in some very curious things along the way. But I'm really, I think, you know, comics have been attacked for a long time, and we keep hoping that that'll be the end of it. But here we are again, and I'm so pleased that you all here are to talk about it and educate us on it and making what you make. So thank you, and I'm out. Honestly.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So with that context in mind, Maya, would you please start us off? I'll
Yes.
do my best to give you maybe a 1-minute warning.
Okay.
But we're at 4:04, so maybe around 4:15, 4:14. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see this. So yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about my book, my first full-length book, Genderqueer, a memoir. It came out in mid-2019, so pretty long time ago at this point. And it is, of course, a story about my life. It's about coming of age, specifically memories and thoughts and experiences relating to gender, sexuality, identity, coming out. I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in a really liberal and accepting family. I had out queer family members before I was even born. So for me, especially as like a high school student in the mid 2000s, even though there was not that much representation that I was able to find in media, I was able to join a queer straight alliance in high school, and I was able to come out to my parents as a high school student and felt quite safe doing so. I knew that it wouldn't, you know, threaten my relationship to my family or my friends or my housing or anything like that. I was still nervous about it because it's hard to share like a big vulnerable thing when you're a young person, and it's hard to talk about stuff that relates to sexuality with your parents. But I had a lot of privilege and a lot of safety in my childhood and youth in coming out as queer. And I also, another part of this is my parents also supported my career as an artist. Hopefully people can see I'm clicking to a new slide here. And when I got to grad school and decided I wanted to pursue comics, I was able to join a very new program at the California College of the Arts. They launched a new MFA in comics program. Mari was one of my teachers in my very first year, and Mari challenged my class to do this memoir-based exercise, which I really struggled with at the time. Up to that point, I'd really only written fiction and a lot of fantasy, a lot of stuff that frankly was quite just reiterations of sort of the fantasy novels I've read in my youth. It was quite derivative. And this sort of exercise really challenged me to think about writing memoir, and specifically to think about the things that have felt like big challenges in my life for the first time. Because even though I felt comfortable coming out as queer as a teenager, I was still really wrestling with gender, and I had much less language to describe that with, and I had way less role models to look for. I didn't meet an out trans or non-binary person until a year or two, I think, after I did this exercise. So I really didn't feel like I had models in my life of like what it would even mean or look like to be like an out trans adult. So that's one of the big sort of things that the book really explores. And then I want to talk a little bit about my process. So after that exercise in which I was challenged to write about myself and about gender, and I really had a hard time with it, I sort of put that topic down for a couple of years, and I really didn't write about gender at all until that was in 2013, until about 3 years later in 2016, when I wanted to start coming out as non-binary to my friends and my family and my professional community. And I was really struggling with how to do so. And I realized, well, of course I should make comics about it, because that is the medium by this point I feel the most fluent in and the most, I guess, eloquent in. So this book started as a series of small black and white journal comics, like the ones on the left, that I was posting on my Instagram. And I was not thinking of this as a book in the very first stages. I was thinking of it as like an art project by which to come out to my community, and also sort of a way for me to clarify my own thoughts about gender and identity and figure out what I was trying to say in kind of the most concise, eloquent, brief version to get my point across. Because I always felt like when I was trying to come out in conversation, I would just trip over my words. I wouldn't be able to finish my point, or someone would ask a follow-up question that would send me off on a whole tangent, or would run out of time, or whatever it was. I just never felt like I was able to fully come out the way I wanted to in conversation. And so I thought, well, I have to write about this. So I wrote probably about 100 of these little black and white strips. And I was very nervous to share them. They felt so intimate and so vulnerable. And at first I just shared them with a sort of a circle of close friends before I was willing to post them online. But when I did start posting them online, they immediately got a response beyond any of the other fictional work I had previously shared. People started to say things like, I didn't know anyone else in the world felt this way. I didn't even know there was like a word for this. Reading these comics make me feel less alone. And people started to come out to me, including people that I'd known for years and years who I never would have thought were questioning their gender, because it wasn't really apparent in their outward appearance, but would say to me, you know, I've really thought about these things too. And I've really also struggled with when and how to share them. And that was really, really powerful. And so after about a year of sharing these black and white comics, I thought, well, maybe this is a book. And I was able to meet an editor through a grad school connection who helped me develop it into a book pitch, and then ended up picking up the book for a company that was called Lion Forge at the time. And for the book version, the publisher asked me to redraw all the small black and white strips at a more standard comic book page size, to re-letter it, and also do all of the comic in color. So you can see here an example of the two of the little black and white strips that kind of got squished together into one full-size page. And I'm really glad that the publisher did push me to do this, because I think a lot is added with the redraw, and I was able to clarify things, and I was able to just draw them a little bit, a little more expansively. And also the colors were done by my sibling, Phoebe Kobabe, who's a character in the book and also my best friend in the world, and who also came out as non-binary about a month before the book was published. So the beautiful colors are done by my sibling. But also when I was working on the book, I didn't have I had to write new material as well. So here's an example, and this is the page that is in the show in Boston that my fellow panelist Joel Christian Gill curated. This is a process page from Genderqueer. But you can see on the far left is an example of one of the little black and white diary comics. And then I decided, okay, I want to use those two panels as the top two panels of the page, but I also want to have a second panel below it that kind of like expands on the theme of what I'm talking about. So then the stage second from the left on line paper is how I thumbnailed the book. I thumbnailed at about print size in a Mead composition notebook on line paper. And I did this because I wanted to be able to see the page at the same size to figure out, okay, how many words do I feel like I can fit on the page, and how many images can I fit on the page? And I really wrote the entire book basically by thumbnailing it. I never created a typed script for this book. The sort of this messy, sort of half drawn, half written version is the first draft. And so you can see there, and then the middle stage is the pencils. That stage was still done on paper and pencil, and then scanned. And then second from the right is the ink stage, in which I traced over my pencils in Photoshop using a Wacom tablet and just like a very simple pencil brush. And then the final stage on the far right is with the digital colors added by Phoebe, which just like bring it all to life. So this book, was published. It was well received right away. The first printing was about 5,000 copies, and they sold out within like a week of release. And we were able to do a second and then a third printing within the first year that it came out, which is pretty exciting. Immediately was very embraced by librarians in particular, who I think saw the book and thought, I know exactly what teen I want to hand this to. And I did, about a 6-month book tour in 2019 to a lot of indie comic shops. And it felt really well received. It wasn't, getting a lot of press, and it certainly wasn't making headlines, but I was very happy with the reception. And then, COVID, I kind of started working on my next book. I wasn't thinking about my first book as much. And then in the fall of 2021, my book just got swept up in the sort of viral wave of book challenges that we are still in to this moment. There are a couple of reasons why I think my book has become almost like the poster child of this moment. I do think the title has something to do with it. I think if you are Google searching like a book about gender or a book about queerness, mine comes up really quick. I also think it is because it won a couple of awards from the American Library Association, which meant that many libraries purchase the award winners. So if a parent saw a news story about a challenge for the book and then thought, oh gosh, is that, book in my child's library as well? It would be, because the librarians had purchased it. And then I also think it is more vulnerable to challenges because it is a graphic novel. So these are the 2 pages that are most commonly cited as the reason the book should not be available to young people. On the left, we have a page in which I quote Alison Bechdel, a winner of a MacArthur grant, whose book has been turned into a Broadway play, like well known as an amazing American author, up there with the best. And then a drawing of an erotic Greek pottery plate that is based on a real one, which is in the Bodleian Museum in England. And then the second page, in which you can see there is a blowjob on a dildo scene. Notably, no one is actually really naked in this scene. You are not actually seeing any real nude body parts in this entire scene. And this is also a scene about consent, in which a character says, I'm actually not comfortable with the sex act that we're doing now. Could we stop and sort of talk about it and do something else? And it's a very affirming scene about speaking to your partner and being really clear about your boundaries and what you're comfortable with, and communication, which is a lesson that I think is very important for teenagers. So these are the pages that most often are cited in, like, specifically school board meetings, when a parent is like showing what they consider the most salacious pages. But I want to end on another image. So this is a poster image that I created last year when the release of the special edition hardcover went out. This is a quote from one page in the book that many, many people have told me is their favorite page and their favorite line from Genderqueer. And it's talking about gender using the metaphor of a landscape and of traveling for gender and transition. And this is really what the book is genuinely about, is about thinking about your place in the world and figuring out who you want to be and whether you need to make changes or come out to reach the place where you can really flourish and grow and express your truest self and be happy and create the work and the friendships and the relationships that you want to have in this world. So yes, that I think is my 10 minutes. And that is what I wanted to share, sort of an intro to this book.
Thank you so much, Maya. Now I want to run out and buy it and read it, and then read it again.
Please do.
All right, Joel, you're up next. About 10 minutes, about 4:25-ish, if you would. Thank you.
Okay, I can do that. I want to first say David Haydu's book, The 10-Cent Plague, is a fantastic book. However, there is some racism in that book that David Haydu puts out when he starts to talk about the idea of how Wortham didn't have any information about, how he didn't include that most of the people that he was studying was Black, as if Black was, there was a natural Black criminology in there. So I just want to give people that little warning. It's a great book, but like everything in America, there's a little bit of diet racism in there. I'm going to talk a little bit about just fights in general and how it came about. Fights. So when I first started drawing comics, I really wanted to tell my own story, but I kept failing over and over again until eventually I ran across the story of Henry Box Brown, who was an enslaved African who mailed himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia to escape from slavery to freedom. And thinking about like encapsulating and understanding how to tell stories, I thought this is a really great story that I could just use. All I got to do is figure out how to draw it. So I started drawing that story, and then eventually I started drawing more. And when you read, if you've ever read Strange Fruit or Tales from the Talented Tenth, those books came about sort of organically as I was going to shows and selling comics and putting things together. I did all of the work in Strange Fruit. I did all of the work in Strange Fruit and Bessie Stringfield and Tales of the Talented Tenth, Bass Reeves. So I did all of those books. And it was about that time that I thought, maybe I can try to tell my own story. But at the time I was still doing a picture. I was doing Fast Enough at the time. So, and I had a student who was working with me who had done flats for all of my other books. And they wanted to see if there was a way that I could pay them to be a studio assistant. And I'm like, I don't know if I have enough work for you. But at the time I'd been thinking about it in much the way that Maya was talking about, like just a little art project. I'm like, I read 2 books. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and Raina Telgemeier's Smile. And with Raina Telgemeier's Smile, I thought this was a really, really interesting way in which to tell a story, is to use dental work as the narrative device that moves the story from chapter to chapter, because there was a lot of things that were happening around that. And at the same time, I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And if you haven't read it, it's a callback to James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, in which he's writing a letter to his nephew, about being Black in America and what it means. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing about now. Not much has changed. I mean, like we don't have lynchings now. We just have police shootings. So we don't have the same performative actions that we had in the town square as we did before, but we kind of do at the same time. And he talked about being Black in America in a way that I had never really thought about. I mean, I'm in Baltimore right now. I'm from Southwestern Virginia, and culture is very similar here. Like, I ordered iced tea today, and it came sweet, which is the way it's supposed to come, FYI. There's a lot of similar things, like similar to the way we talk. The people look the same, right? And he talked about this thing about being an American, about protecting your body, and about the idea of what it means to protect your body from the time that you're a kid. Like my mom used to say, I'm going to be, like, she said the same thing to me that Ta-Nehisi Coates said to his mother, said to him, like, I'm going to beat you so the police won't. It was that sort of thing, that you're always protecting your body. And he said some things that really stuck with me at the time. And one of the things is how he would not go to certain parties if he didn't have enough people with him. And that was something that I had just ingrained in my head and just did naturally. It's kind of like, I just didn't go to that party over there or that mall over there because they shoot, or, there's something else that's going on. So I was, I had never really thought about like that as being me as a teenage boy in Southwestern Virginia, protecting my body. I never really considered that. And so after reading those two books, I'm like, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about my life, but in terms of the fights that I got into as a kid? Specifically because the fights were, they weren't isolated. They weren't these things that happened because I was a sociopath or a violent kid. Like by the time I got to school some days in the morning, I had already been through some shit. So, it was one of those things, like, you don't get to see what's happening underneath when a kid comes to school. And so I thought, like, what if I told that story about kids who grew up like I did, who grew up surviving sexual abuse, who grew up surviving, diet to severe racism and bullying and, poverty. Like, what if I told a story about that and put the fights in the context in which I was living in much the same way that Raina did in Smile, but also, calling back to the idea of being Black in America and having to protect your body. So I started the book thinking this is going to be a little side project I can do between other things. And then my student worker, who became my assistant, they ended up coloring fights. I said, well, what we can do, since I don't have enough work for you, because I was finishing Strange Fruit 2 at the time, I said, since I don't have enough work for you, I was going to make this book black and white. So I can let you color it. And if we sell it, I'll credit you as a colorer and I'll pay you for it. And they were like, okay, Joel, that sounds great. And then we sold the books 2 weeks later. Like, it was legitimately, like, I wasn't even trying to sell the book. It was just like, I got a call and people were like, I heard you're doing this book. And I'm like, from where? Is there like a mic in my studio? And so we ended up selling the book. And so I worked on it. And I'm going to show some pages in a minute. I just want to talk through some things first. So one of the things that I really struggled with fights was to include the sexual abuse that I suffered as a kid. And I remember when I was like doing thumbnails and thinking about this, because the fights were enough, the racism was enough, the poverty was enough. Like, there would just be this one more thing that I had to draw. So I like to stop drawing for like 2 days and just thought about it. And then I just thought about all of the people. I think there's a rapper right now who has talked about being molested as a kid, who's like a big tough guy rapper, and he's like, a lot of men don't talk about this, and we need to talk more about it. And I was just like, I got to get in touch with this guy. Because like that's exactly why I wrote Fights, because a lot of people don't talk about these things. And so it becomes an uncommon, a lot of men don't talk about it, especially Black men don't talk about it. And so it becomes this like secret shame that you sort of live with unless go through the process of going through therapy and, realizing that that doesn't make you gay, or, like you don't have, like, it wasn't your fault, and like all of the things that sort of victims have to go through. And so I wanted to tell that story. So I just basically sat down and said, I'm gonna put it in. And then it became a way of like, how do you do that? And so with telling the story, this is the cover. And yes, like even though I don't have hair now, this is the hair that I had at 17, with the blonde streak and everything. It was sort of like, how do you tell this story now? And I really just thought about like centering the loss that I had. I'm going to go through these pages really quickly. This was my fake Michael Jackson jacket that I had in 1983, 84, because I couldn't afford a real one. So I got a plastic one that would stretch in the summertime when you went outside. And of course I wore it in the summertime because it was Michael Jackson. And that glove, by the way, was a Revco kit. If anybody from the South knows about Revco, Revco was what CVS eventually became. And you glued your own sequins on it. So that was me doing that. And in 1985, my father died under very suspicious circumstances. And so I want to say this too really quickly, that most of this stuff I really just I thought about it in terms of like my memory. So I just drew basically the things that I remembered. And like this image of him is the last time I saw him, which was something that just kind of ingrained in my head. And another time when he had fallen off of a ladder. This actually, the image on the right is the last time I saw him. But the only pictures I had of me and him up until like maybe 5 years ago were me beside his coffin, because my grandmother took a bunch of pictures beside his coffin. So those are the memories that kind of stood out. And the thing that was really interesting about my father in terms of, being Black and having an absentee father, most people don't talk about where all those fathers are. They're mostly in jail, caught up in the criminal justice system, which was designed specifically to attack Black people, but that's an entire other lecture altogether. Is that my dad wasn't there because he couldn't be. And so he became a saint. And when that saint happened, so I had like this positive idea of this man that I was supposed to live up to be that didn't actually exist. So I wanted to make sure that I put that in there. And so like these are drawings directly from the pictures. But the other thing I wanted to say, this is an actual thing where I was drowning, and I remember drawing this fireman. And because the kids, they asked me a question and I was like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I had never thought of it. This is like a thing that had never crossed my mind. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about was how I sort of pictured the sexual abuse in the book. And so I just thought about it in terms of like these amorphous, word balloons that didn't have, like didn't have any substance. And I wanted to sort of put that visual language out there. So when people saw that, that's what they thought. That's it. I want to show you one more thing, which is my studio space. This is typically how I work. I work digitally 100%. I work in a sketchbook. I do thumbnails on a sketchbook, and then I draw on a Cintiq. And that's, I think I've talked way longer than I'm supposed to, so I'm going to stop there.
No, actually, you're right on time.
Oh, awesome.
Thanks
I was
so
afraid
much.
I was going to talk too much. So
no, you're good. Everyone is practicing some really good self-discipline. Very impressive. All right, Mari, you're up next. Do you need me to share your slides?
Yes. So I'm just going to talk a little, and maybe you could just like rotate the slides while I'm talking.
Okay.
That's okay.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. You can begin, and I'll orient my computer here.
Okay, great. So my name is Mari Naomi. I have been making comics since 1997. I think my first published comic was 1998 in Action Girl Comics. I've been doing a lot of different kinds of comics, mostly autobio, mostly for mature audiences. But the one that got banned was not the one I expected. It was my young adult series. So I'm going to talk a little about that. all of my comics are pretty different from one another. So when I talk about technique, I'm just going to be talking about this one comic. Origin story, I came up with the idea for the first book in the Life on Earth trilogy called Losing the Girl. In 2009, I had an agent and we were pitching my first book, Kiss and Tell, which eventually got picked up by Harper Perennial. But while we were in the pitching sessions, we had interest from various publishers, and who, like, one of them was Little Brown, who was interested in the content. By the way, my cat is screaming in the background, just ignore. They were interested in the content, but mostly like the teen content, because the other stuff was a little more mature. So they asked me if I could write a young adult book. There might have been young adult comics at the time, but this was 2009. Raina Telgemeyer's Smile didn't come out for another year or two. And we were kind of in this space at that time in the graphic novel or in the comics industry where graphic memoirs were just starting to become a thing. We were still kind of writing off of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and before that, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And publishers were like, "Oh, is this our next cash cow?" So they were just throwing money at people, and luckily, I got in there right under the gun, right before they realized that no, comics are not that profitable. Well, they became profitable eventually, but at the time they were not. Anyway, so that's how I got Kiss and Tell published. But so when Little Brown asked me if I could do a young adult book, I'd never actually read young adult, even as a young adult. So they sent me a bunch of prose books, just so I could see what young adult was like. Again, there weren't really any young adult graphic novels yet. And I'm like, sure, I could do this. And at the time I was going through something where I was trying to look through someone else's eyes. Like in my personal life, I was going through a situation where I just could not see a point of view of this person I knew. And so I got this idea for my graphic novel pitches that I would write the story through different protagonist points of view. I have not seen it, but I hear that Rashomon does this. And with each chapter coming from a different perspective, it was also drawn in a different perspective as per how they're feeling in that moment. And, over the course of the book, things change a little, like a black and white person, like who thinks about black and white might suddenly turn gray, like you see in here. Or if someone feels cute, then they might appear cute in a panel, and then they feel ugly, then they might appear ugly in another panel, or whatever like that. So it was all very much about perspective, which as far as I knew, or as far as I know, it had never been done in a graphic novel at that point. And I don't think it still has, although there might have been smaller comics made like this. Anyway, so I was very excited about this concept. Unfortunately, Little Brown was not. And it actually took me many, many years to sell this, the pitch. A lot of publishers were interested, but they were not interested in the art aspect, which to me, I found was the most important part of the pitch. The story is just a regular teenage drama with like a little bit of alien abduction, maybe, typical teen story. But what I really felt was important was the perspectives, because that's all about empathy or compassion, and that was the whole point of these books and art in general, and that's how we're going to have world peace ultimately, is through empathy. But anyway, so long story short, the books didn't get picked up until, the first book, this book, Life on Earth, came out in 2018. So that was almost 10 years after I came up with a pitch. So it probably took about a year to sell it. So it probably got purchased in 2016 or 2017. I worked very closely with the editor for Lerner Publishing. He was familiar with some of the other books that I did before. And he mostly worked on me to tone it down from, I'm used to doing some pretty mature content. I mean, not really porn, but like usually sex is involved, because I did a lot of writing about my sex life as a teen and young adult. So there is a bit of that in this book, but so a lot of his notes to me ended up like, tone this part down, take out this body part, take out the swear word. Like I really had to fight every time I wanted to include something. And it really made me think like, you know, how important is this to the story? So I got pretty good at that, I think. And oh gosh, my cat is just yelling. Anyway, so basically we just really didn't want the book to be banned. And he was like, yeah, young adult gatekeepers are pretty brutal. You know, anything is, could be flagged and make them not purchase it for their library or whatever. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll trust you. But I did feel like he was being a little bit over, like just not overbearing, but like over protective, like overly cautious. But, you know, again, I'd never been in this industry before. So I just, you know, I mostly let him have what he wanted. And so I came out with this book. I was pretty happy about it. And it got really good reviews, except on Goodreads, you could see a lot of young adult gatekeepers talking about the reasons they did not find this book suitable for children. And they were very surprising. For example, like one person was very upset that there were no strong father figures in the story. It's really about kids. The adults are kind of in it, but I mean, more so than Charlie Brown, but that's just an example. There were definitely a lot of little ways that people were picking at it, like, oh, this is inappropriate, this person is not a good person, because not all my characters are good people. And so that's how the book came up along. And so it ended up being a trilogy. And let's see, the friend that I was trying to see things from her perspective, like I wasn't ready to write about it in memoir form when it came out, but I did eventually write about it in this book that's coming out this month. But let me skip ahead. So because the last book came out in the pandemic, and this is simplifying it overly, for whatever reason, my agent thinks it's because of the pandemic, the book failed. Like the last book in the trilogy, and that was when I was going to really push it and tour for it. I got to do 2 bookstore events, and then that was March 2020, and then I had to go home and stay in place, and everything got canceled. And it was really hard to promote something during the pandemic, but like obviously I've been working on these books for 10 years, so it was pretty traumatic. The books didn't do well through either a mistake or because of how things went. The books ended up being pulped, some of them before I could get my author's copy. It was pretty traumatic. And I'm like, wow, I'm never doing young adult again. But even though the reviews were great, but I feel like if the book had come out like 6 months later, then I could have been on the whole like virtual tour circuit, but that's not how it happened. Anyway, the books didn't do well. But then one day, like 2 years later, or maybe, no, actually it was only like a month or 2 after I found out that they'd been pulped, because that was years later. One of my close friends called me and said, did you know your book got banned? And I'm like, oh, great. Like I got pulped and now it's banned in Texas, which is actually where I was born. So that was insult to injury. And I learned that through the LA Times, I learned that the book was banned for queer content, which was interesting because there is not really any queer content in the first book that got banned. Books 2 and 3 have queer content, and I'm queer. I'm guessing that the parents just like Googled queer authors or queer comics and then found my name because I run the queer cartoonist database or something, and then saw that I had a book and just got that banned on that alone, because seriously, there's like no queer content in book 1. But anyway, so that got banned, and then suddenly everyone wanted to buy it because it was a banned book. And the books were all out of print, and so they put it back into print, and suddenly all of my other books went into print. And so thanks Texas and conservatives, because you've revived my career. And that's my story in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Mari. Let's ban all your books and get them back on the bestseller list.
Oh boy.
All right. Joe, it is now your turn to share with us. About 10 minutes or so would leave us about a half an hour for Q&A.
Great. Can folks see my slides? Excellent. All right, so I'm going to go very quickly because I'm a firm believer in moving to Q&A as quickly as possible, particularly with groups of teachers. So just going to give a little bit of context to the work that we're doing in New York City, and also sort of kind of speak to, and I think what's really wonderful about the panel so far is there's a lot of hope, even within kind of the banning and the attacks on content that is taking place in this current moment. So I do work in the New York City Department of Education, in the Department of Social Studies and Civics. And a lot of our work with comics kind of goes back to the development of our Passport to Social Studies curriculum. We were the first large district to adopt the March trilogy into our 8th grade curriculum. And actually through that work, we got connected with Andrew Iden and the late congressman, and actually have been working with Andrew to produce comics. Putting this up here, if you would like to see any of the things that I speak to, if you click on that QR code, I'll also come back to it on the back end where you can see the comics that we've created and download and use, whatever you would like. So I do want to start off here, and this is a recent tweet from one of the writers who wrote our most recent recognized comic, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second, Clay Kane. He said, I had the honor of writing comics on Larry Kramer and Bayard Rustin for the New York City Department of Education, Civics for All Comics Group, and our Hidden Voices project in collaboration with Good Trouble Productions, which is Andrew Iden, Kelly Sudaconic, and Val DeLandro's collaboration to create nonfiction comics. And he then said, I'm sure if this was released in Florida, it would get banned, release date coming soon, but check out the cover below. And I think I'm starting here because I think it is important, and Nick started off in talking about rhythm and narrative, and we all recognize that's what I think partly why we're here today, the importance of narrative. Within the conversations about book banning, I think it's equally important to talk about the fact that we're actually creating some across the board content for students that they have access to. They may not have direct access, unfortunately, in their libraries, but this is sort of the power of the moment through social media and the internet, where we can get this content to students. We just have to be creative about how we do it. So yes, while Clay's book would be banned and definitely not written and published in Florida, we have published it in New York City. We make everything available for anyone who wants to use it. All of our work is grounded in kind of the CRSE framework, which is something from the state. Not going to spend too much time here on the way kind of CRSE has been synthesized for the state. But what I think is really important is for us, it creates a space to really think about representation, to think about voices, and to create these materials for folks. And we've used within our Department of Education, we've created a little publishing house, which we call the Civics for All Comics Group, which all of our comics are published under. And, I'll start with recognized. Recognized one was a comic that we published 2 years ago. It is part of our Hidden Voices series, which is really focusing on looking at LGBTQ voices and bringing them into the curriculum throughout the curriculum. And in this case, we worked with several creators to publish Recognize, which tells the story of Elaine Locke and Sylvia Rivera. And it allows kind of a fictional framing to tell these histories. We then published Recognize 2, which Clay Kane wrote both stories. The first is on Bayard Rustin, and the second is on Larry Kramer. All of our stories, again, kind of create a point of access through a fictional framing that then gets into the historic content. We produced a comic for teachers called Any Questions, which allows for kind of professional development through following a fictional teacher who is trying to make their school more LGBTQ inclusive and affirming. And part of this was, and I love that Mari Naomi brought up kind of empathy in comics, because I think this allows for us to have some conversations that oftentimes are sort of done in a ham-fisted way through things like role playing, where we can actually have the conversation but focus on a text rather than forcing people to take on the role of. So that was part of the impetus for any questions, which I should note, Hugh Ryan, who is a scholar who works in the New York City area, author of When Brooklyn Was Queer, wrote the script for any questions, and then Christy Rode, who is a artist in New York City, did the drawings. And then finally, just want to bring up Barrier Breaker, which is working with two scholars who have a recent YA biography of Jackie Robinson, a retelling of not Jackie Robinson's story in terms of the baseball. It does talk about that and talks about his role in breaking the color barrier, but really focuses on his activism. Going to highlight here, and would be happy to talk about in Q&A kind of some of the lessons learned, but just to point out that I think this is possible not just in New York City, but other districts. One of the things we always kind of speak to is like, it's really important to bring in the expertise. We don't create the comics. We work with artists, with writers. We're working with Mari Naomi actually, and Greg Pak on a AAPI comic right now. We have a lot of different things, but we always work with the expertise, right? We're not the ones. We want to, really make these comics look like they could be something that's coming from a comics publishing house. But also recognizing the privileged position of large districts where we can create some of this comic content that we can then share with the rest of the country to get to those places where, one of my favorite stories to tell is I am in contact with a teacher in Texas. You can see some of the posters that we have that are part of our Hidden Voices. We sent him the posters because he was like, I can't get this where I am. But then he showed it in his classroom where he's like, I know I'm, pushing boundaries here, but I wanted to get this out for my students. So recognizing our privileged position to create some of this and get it out to folks. It's bad, but there's hope. And then it is really important to recognize, particularly in thinking about comics, that the demand is incredibly great at this moment, but also that there's no need to create a new process. Folks like us, folks like the rest of the panelists, there are processes to get this work out. So I will end there. Again, the QR code if you want to see the comics a little bit more in depth, and happy to talk about any of this or any of the other work during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Joe. Meredith has already started us off in the chat with an interesting question. Open to anyone on the panel if you just want to unmute yourself and share your thoughts. Meredith's question: a lot of libraries stopped purchasing books in favor of ebooks. How has this impacted comics and graphic novels?
I don't know specifically how it's. I mean, there's a smaller like we get smaller money because of ebook. And I mean it's greater access, but it's smaller money because it's a little bit cheaper to give a book out. I don't know what you guys, the share of your ebooks or digital books are, but it's a little bit. I don't know. I mean, people are still reading stuff. But at the same time, I think comics in a lot of ways, like records, are still things that people want to hold, right? Like they want to hold them in their hands. Like I legitimately will buy a digital copy and I will buy a hard copy at the same time. And like Maya's book, I bought Air's book twice. I bought it one as a hard copy and one as a digital copy. So I could reference it, when I'm talking, because, if I have my iPad, I can reference everything. And I typically do that a lot, mostly because of ease. But when I'm just reading a book, I want to have an actual book in my hand.
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer to this. I can tell I'm just happy that libraries are buying it at all. And I know that there are people who prefer to read in ebook format or print format for various reasons, one of them being accessibility. So I'm kind of just like, even if I get a smaller amount of royalties, I'm like, as long as it's there. The bar is low at this point. Please just have a copy available. Thank you.
I have nothing to say on ebooks. I've never read an ebook, and sounds great though.
All right. Thanks. Christia asks, I would love to hear any candid thoughts from the authors on both sides of the experience, feeling validated, but also put down, silenced by being banned or attacked. How do you find balance in that?
I'll start. When I found out that my book was banned, I was so bummed. And for years, I'd always joked that I wanted to be banned, that, you know, I would get the cred and then get the sales. But, you know, honestly, most people who get banned will never know that they were banned. They're not going to get written up by the LA Times. They're just going to probably disappear quietly because they didn't get sales and they didn't know why. So I was really one of the lucky ones. Just, I don't know why the LA Times picked up that of all things, but my name got in the paper and that's what helped me. But it could have just as easily, you know, stubbed me out like the cigarette butt that I was. My feelings were very, very hurt. And it made me really sad for kids just and having to deal with that stuff. Although when I was a kid, I would actively seek out banned books. I think that's how I ended up reading 1984 when I was like 11. I mean, but like, I don't know. I don't think all kids have that, you know, have the ability, or maybe they do. It's been so long since I've been a kid. I don't know, but it really hurt my feelings. But I'm glad that was just silver lining. But like, I don't know. Can I say that I wish I weren't banned? I wish nobody was banned, but I also had done better. And I wish there hadn't been a pandemic. Like, I feel like the pandemic kind of took my career away, and it also gave it back to me in this form of like the banned book thing. But like, I mean, neither of those things probably would have happened if it weren't for COVID. So
You know, it's
think
really interesting. I'm sorry, I was just gonna say, like, the moral panic of banning, it happens it happens all the time.
cyclical.
Right?
Yeah.
It's very cyclical. We were banning novels because it was turning women's brains into mush because they were living in fantasy worlds, which is what reviewers were saying, because women were reading novels, right, at the turn of the century. And you know, if it's not rock and roll, it's not hip hop, right? I don't know if anybody remembers Two Live Crew, but they were a pretty shitty rap group until people banned them, and then they became super popular. They were not good. Like, and the only reason why I bought that album when I was like 14 was because it was banned. Like, ooh, this is something that you're not supposed to do. When Ted Cruz went on the floor of the Supreme Court nominations for Ketanji Brown Jackson, he took, you know, anti-racist baby on there. Ibram made a shit ton of money because of that. Do you know what I mean? Like, it seems like they don't understand that by doing what they're doing, it basically, like, it's better for books to, like, for you just ignore those things. It's like, than to go out and spend time with this moral panic, because it just doesn't make any sense. They just make make people more successful. And the only people that it actually hurts, like banning book actually hurts kids whose parents can't afford to buy the book because they can't go to the library and get it. And so that's the part of the problem. But, you know, like, also, just FYI, everybody, the internet's not real. It's not real. It's not a real thing. Like, I get called racist on the internet every other week. I was once called a soft-spoken race baiter, right? None of that stuff is real. So like, nobody's gonna like shut me up by banning anything. They can tell me I'm banned, but luckily free speech does not have a like age limit or like anything. I can say what I want, and I'm going to say what I want. So they can ban me all they want, and they can try, and I will laugh and smile, and I'll eat in the kitchen and grow strong, because I too am American.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I'm in many ways very grateful that my book didn't get caught up in the bans until it had been out for 2.5 years, because it meant that I had 2.5 years of really lovely, supportive feedback and readers reaching out to me. I was getting daily Instagram messages from readers who loved my book saying this meant so much to me, or this is how I related to it, or like, you know, I gave it to my parents, now they're better at using my pronouns, like this really good stuff. Because I do think that if it had been banned immediately, I would have panicked and thought, have I made a mistake? Is my book actually bad? Is my book actually harmful? they're throwing, they throw out these words specifically when they're trying to ban queer narratives. They say it's pedophilia, it's pornography, you're a groomer, you should be in jail, you should die, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if I had gotten that immediately, it would have been way more hurtful and I would have internalized it more. But because it came 2.5 years down the line, when I'd had multiple printings, it had already been translated into a couple of languages, and again, it'd been really warmly received, I was, because of that, able to kind of be like, this is not true. Like, these accusations they're throwing at my book are not true, especially because in many of these early cases of people challenging genderqueer, they would say in a printed quote, I haven't read the book, but I don't think anyone else should read it either. I don't think it should be in schools. And it's just like, that is not a reflection of my work, because you literally didn't even read my work. So for that reason, I think I found it less hurtful and less scary than I would have, again, if the bans had happened immediately, like the week of release. But that's actually also part of it, is that like so many of the challenges and bans feel like media stunts. My book was also sued in the state of Virginia. A congressional hopeful from Virginia who was running a distant third in his congressional race sued a Barnes & Noble over carrying genderqueer, saying it was obscene, along with another book, which was a fantasy het fairy tale paranormal romance novel by Sarah J. Maas. And he sued them. He sued a Barnes & Noble, and he tried to set the court case for exactly 2 weeks before the primary election was going to happen. And then the judge literally took one look at the case and pushed the hearing until after the primary, because it was so obvious that this was a publicity stunt to try to get his name in the newspapers to gain him votes. And so I'm like, again, that's not a statement on my work. That is someone trying to capitalize on a viral moment for their own gain. And I want to repeat what Joel said, which is like, my book being challenged, it has wasted a lot of my time, and it has at times been very stressful and irritating, but it hasn't hurt my career. It has boosted sales. It has given me a platform that I didn't previously have. I've been on NPR multiple times. I've been featured in the New York Times. I've been featured in the LA Times, things that were not happening for me as a midlist author with one title before this. But so the people who are hurt by the challenges, again, are like the most marginalized readers are the ones who are being further marginalized. In the case of queer texts, it's kids who don't have disposable income or who have an unaccepting family and so wouldn't feel safe bringing a really obviously queer book into their home because they think it might be challenged. And then in the case of books that touch on race, racism, the history of race in America, it's just like removing this like really crucial piece of information out of the access of both like white students who maybe have never heard about this and are very ignorant on the topic, or students of color who might like really relate or like need these stories to feel represented. It's just, it's cutting off this access, and it's like telling anyone from the marginalized group who would relate to the story, we don't want your story here. Your identity is inappropriate for the classroom, which is just like a really shitty thing to hear as a young person when you're already just trying to find your way in the world.
All right. Thank you,
I
Maya.
want to, can I just add to that?
Sure thing.
You sort of mentioned race, and I've been thinking about classrooms and like just like as a kid in the 80s, like they didn't talk about the Japanese internment camps at all. And like I knew it because my family has a history of being in the camps. But like as a kid, being one of the only Asian kids, like, I mean, it's not that I didn't believe it happened, but I don't think I believed it was as horrible as it was, because no one talked about it. People talked about the Holocaust, and I was like, oh, well, like, yeah, that's really terrible. But like, it just never, just, I don't know. It almost doesn't seem real if it's not in history class or something. I don't know. I'm a high school dropout, so maybe they talked about it later. But I feel like only now, I'm almost 50, and I'm kind of finally just learning about that whole time. And I, obviously I've had time to learn about it, but I don't think I was ready before because it was intense. But like, these are some of the books that are being banned. Like internment camp stories are some of the books that are being banned, like definitely the racial thing. And that's, that's all I have to say before getting
it's so frustrating. Like the Matt Krause list. Matt Krause is a politician in Texas who created this list of 850 books that he didn't think were appropriate to be in Texas schools. Book Riot did a really good breakdown of like what was on the list, and it was like queer, trans, non-binary stories, stories about race, racism, the history of race in America, and then stories about sex ed, abortion, safe sex, consent, and then books about students' rights, like the rights of students towards privacy of their own information and that kind of thing. Those were the 4 major topics that were being hit. And I'm like, literally, what do teens need to know about more than those 4 topics?
All right. I hope I'm saying this right. Someone contributed a question in the chat. Pineda asks, what was the process like for you when unpacking personal narratives into a comic? What strategies or routines helped you get to the point where you felt comfortable expressing vulnerable narratives?
Therapy. Like that's the, like I'm with my students in visual narrative, they're making comics. There are a couple of students who are dealing with I mean, there's one student who's making a comic about, a half Asian, half Jewish cowgirl in the Old West out for revenge. It's just great. And her personality is fantastic. So, but there are some people who are making some really interesting and heavy topics. And I talk to them about, like, you just got to get right with it. Maya said something at our talk in the fall, which has really stuck with me. And I keep repeating it to my students a lot, which is you're going to have to do a book report every year when you write a book that people want to talk about. And so with that being said, I've told a couple of my students about, like it's okay to be emotional, right? Like, I'm not saying don't feel like you're going to cry if somebody asks you a question. But at the same time, get comfortable, because that can get draining, especially if it becomes very successful. It can be very draining to go into an interview, which I have done, and feel like I just sat through a therapy session, but it was just like a radio, right? So, and then everybody could hear it, right? So, like, just be prepared for that. And so, like, I mean, and I think it helps to tell other people the stories, and to say things out loud. It helps you. Like the sexual abuse that I dealt with as a kid was something that, in a lot of ways, if you are a survivor of sexual abuse, then there are a lot of things you go through. As a man, like, am I gay? Does that mean I'm gay? Right? Does that mean that did I warrant those things? My answer to the first one was, like, when I went to a party and there was more boys than girls, I was disappointed, so I knew I wasn't gay at that point. That was like the flag. I was disappointed there weren't enough girls there. But but that's like, you just got to get right with that stuff. Whatever the story you're going to tell, you have to get right with it, because if you don't get right with it, it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to tell stories about it. And also, if you can't get right with it, you can't speak about it authentically. And I think that's very important, because there are people who talk about things, and you see these stories out there that it's clear that this is not an authentic story, or they don't feel the way they do about it, and it just feels hollow, and it's going to feel like you're bleeding. And it should, I think, and especially if it's something that's painful and you're dealing with trauma, it will feel like it's bleeding. It should feel like being naked in front of the world, and that's when you've made it authentic.
Yeah, I think you have to build up to it. Like I said, my first attempt at writing about gender was in this class that Mari was teaching, and the comic I wrote was so full of this sort of sardonic, almost cynical tone, where I was really, like, almost making fun of myself for having these doubts. And you could just read it and be like, it's just so obvious that the author of this piece is not comfortable talking about these topics yet. And I had to walk away from it for like 3 years, and then come back later when I'd done more thinking and more growing and more learning and more talking. And then I also think, like, it started with journaling, and then it went on to sketch comics, and then it went to sharing it to only a very intimate circle of friends, and then it became emailing it to my extended family, and then it was posting it on my Instagram. So I kind of took all of these baby steps of, like, I would sort of test the waters of, like, I'll send it out to a very small group of people, and then if I receive good feedback, I'll feel more confident to share it with a wider circle of people, and so on and so on. So I also think that there can be, like, trying to build your way up to it. And I definitely think that, therapy can be one of those pieces, or just like a lot of self-examination and journaling, and to find the way that you can tell the story that feels comfortable and cathartic, in a good way and not like you are like ripping bandages off that still need to be wrapped because the wound underneath is too fresh.
That is how I generally describe writing painful autobio is it's not like you're ripping a Band-Aid off. It's like you're digging into a scar and reopening the wound. Sorry to be gross, but that's how it feels. Like you're like, oh, this is healed. I guess it's time to just tear it open again. I generally like what I tend to tell students to do is, I mean, you can always write about stuff in the moment. In fact, you always should take notes and write in your journal, but you should give it time. And if you feel like you're not ready, like the longer that goes by, the better the story is going to be because the more perspective you'll be. However, it's not that there's not value too in the immediacy of like a journal comic or something that's like in the moment. I mean, here's the thing. I've been saying this for like 15 years, and now I just like screwed it up because this book that I just wrote that's about to come out was written as it was happening. So like, there goes my, but I do feel like overall it's really good to have perspective and to be able to look back at it and not have panic attacks. I only recently started getting therapy, and I think most of my books wouldn't have been written if I had therapy. So that as you will.
Thanks. Your responses to this question remind me of a little factoid that I learned recently, that the root of the word passion relates to the same root of the word suffering, as in the Passion of the Christ. And that passion implies that you're willing to suffer for something you're passionate about. And it just seems to me that in all that you've shared, there's a significant degree of suffering to work through, to get to your art, to imbue it with meaning, and with the therapeutic value it seems to have for you.
Can I speak to that also, what Joel was saying about being ready to talk about it in front of audiences? Because I do feel like I went on tour years ago, and John Porcelino was touring his movie, and we did a gig together, and it's about having just like this really, really traumatic stuff that was happening to him. And, you know, watching the movie felt traumatizing to me, like, and then everyone was asking him all these really personal questions. And like after him, or like maybe it was after or during, I'm like, how do you deal with this every night? You've been doing this every night. And he's just like, oh, I just kind of zone out. He's like, I'm not really here. I'm just disassociating. And which I was just like, whoa. But like a lot of this stuff, I mean, that I've written about that was traumatic, either I won't talk about it in public because like I just don't want to talk about it, or I've already processed it so much, especially by spending so much time with it with a comic, that it feels like it happened to someone else. Like it doesn't even feel like I'm talking about myself. I feel like I'm talking about a protagonist in a book, even though it is technically my life. So I don't know, it's a very complex thing, writing about yourself and just how much distance you have to give. Like I cannot fathom the amount of people who've read my books. I mean, Maya, you even more, I'm sure. It's like you just can't have,
you
like,
can't think about it too hard, can't think about it too much.
No, like my editor, the very first time I published a book, Kiss and Tell, like she was sitting there with her elbow on my book, and it was open, her elbow was on my crotch, and that's when she told me that they were doing 10,000 printings of my book. And I'm just like, at this point, I'd just been making zines my whole life, and I was just like, and I'm staring at my crotch under her elbow and thinking, like, 10,000 people are gonna look at this. Like, and I asked, like, I don't know how I feel about that. She's like, just don't think about it. And I didn't, and I haven't since.
Okay.
That's definitely a weird thing. But before that, Nick, you asked a question before that we all wanted to say we were going to talk about while we were on camera right before we went on. Do you remember what that question was? I can't remember what it was.
I remember.
I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, you had pitched a question of had we thought about making like a a younger reader edition of our book, and or like an abridged version or something like that, specifically of a title of ours that had perhaps been challenged for having more mature content? Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, it came up in the pre-discussion. Did you want to go first, Joel?
Yeah, I have not thought about that. I mean, I've thought about doing other stories. Like one of my, like, back to passion, my passion projects, when I get rid of all of this other stuff that I'm doing, I say that like it's a bad thing, but it's not. I just, like, I want to do this book is a story that's really about like the happy moments in my childhood, because there were a lot of things. And it's a book called I Wish I Could Draw What Summer Smells Like, which I've already started drawing some, which is just about, like, just being a free range kid in the projects in Southwestern Virginia in the 80s, where, you maybe talk to an adult once a month when you came inside, that kind of thing. And I want to do that story, which I think is going to be, but, like, I'm Black and I grew up Black in Reagan's America. I hope he burns in hell with Rush Limbaugh. But, so racism still comes into play, like, like the interactions with teachers and like the white kids that grew up in the projects with me. So that stuff will still be there, because I can't really write a story about it without putting that in there. But I haven't really thought about dumbing down or sanitizing or comics coding my other works.
I mean, no one would read it, like the dumbed down version. Like, you could make one version that the library could carry, and then the kids will seek out the one that's uncensored.
So you'd have to put that, you'd have to write on it though, like, this is the censored version, so kids would like see. So that would make more sense in marketing, because then kids would seek out
and then put like the cover image of the uncensored version on the back. Like, if you want the good parts, get this version. Yeah, the reason I remembered this question is because literally when I was on book tour for Genderqueer, I got asked over and over by parents, would you consider releasing a more child-friendly version of this book? Because I had all these parents coming up to me at book signing saying, I read this and it was so helpful and I want to share it with my gender-conforming child, but my child is 12 or 10 or 8 or 6. And like, I generally recommend my book for high school and above. And so they were saying, like, I really want to share this with my kid, but there's just like 5 or 6 pages. And what I told them was, in your own personal copy that you bought, you can tape some pages together, like, or paperclip them or something. Like, you can, if you want to like edit your own one copy, go for it. But I am not going to release an edited version of my memoir. That feels weird. I don't want to censor my life. Like, I don't want to do that. But because I got asked that question so many times, what I thought was, well, I can write another book that hopefully will address this need or this niche. So the next book, the one I just sold to Scholastic, it's called Sachi's Stories. I wrote it with a co-author, my friend Lucky Srikumar, who's another non-binary cartoonist, wonderful author, is wrestling with many of the same questions as Genderqueer, gender identity questioning, but in the junior high years and through a fictional character. And my hope is that this next book will kind of meet that need that so many people ask me for, which is a book that wrestles with these same gender questions, but it's about a younger character and does not include the sort of going into like adult sexual relationships, because the character is 12. So that's my answer, is like, I'm not going to edit this book, but I'll write another book.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Nikhil has asked another good question in the chat. And Joe, perhaps you can weigh in on this as well, since you're instrumental in producing some comics, or at least managing the production of some comics. What kinds of conversations do you hope your books bring up for students and or other readers?
I'll start just quickly.
Yeah.
I think one of the things in terms of the comics we create is really thinking about comics as an entry point, and not, and I want to be very explicit about this, not comics as something different from other texts, but, and this is why I think it's really important, going back to Joel's comment about like hard copies of comics, is, so when we produce these comics, we print 100,000 or so copies of each comic. And the point being, we want to get them in the kids' hands so they read them, and then they're like, oh, I want to consume more. Hopefully it's an entry point to other comics, but it can also be an entry point to the stories that are told in those comics. So that's, I would say, the primary purpose of why we're producing comics.
My hope is that, you know, I wrote, and I think I wrote this in the afterwards of Fight, where I said that, you know, I wrote this as a love letter to kids who grew up like I did. And it's my hope that that kids will kids that read this, even though it's got a mature audience label on it, will read this and realize that while they are unique, their problems aren't, and that there are other people who have gone through the same things. And it doesn't, you know, the things that happen to you don't define who you are. You know, they are a part of you, and which is a weird thing for me to say to a lot of people, because I don't like regret. So I like who I am now. And so I wouldn't change anything about my life, which is definitely a weird thing to say as a sexual abuse survivor. But at the same time, you know, it's about accepting who I am and not being like, there's these parts of me that I don't like. That's definitely a spiral that I don't want anybody else to go down. And so it's, you know, my hope that people will read this, kids will read this, and people who work with kids like I will read this and really just build some empathy for kids. Comics are the ultimate empathy machine. And I think that if you can read this story, and then realize that kid that's acting out at lunchtime in the morning isn't like just a sociopath or a psychopath, like they might have gone through something. It reminds me of this really interesting story. My wife said that there was this woman that when we were first married, we'll be married 28 years in 2 weeks, but when we were first married, there was this woman that worked in this customer service place with her, and there was something going on with this woman, and her personal hygiene was getting worse and worse and worse, and people couldn't figure out what she was still coming to work, and it was just like it was just getting worse. And so finally, as opposed to like telling her that she needed to go fix that problem, they just asked her what was going on, and it turns out she was suffering from spousal abuse, and she was like sleeping in her car and didn't have any help. And so like all they did was change the notion about, like, as opposed to saying you need to fix this problem, to find out what was wrong. And like that would help so many kids. Can you imagine how many kids we would help if we just asked them what was wrong in the morning, as opposed to like sending them to the principal or calling the resource officer or some other bullshit that happens in American education? Just like talk to kids, right? Be the adult you needed as a kid is what I would hope people would do.
Right on. That does seem like a very positive and helpful note to end on. So thank you for that, Joel. Nikhil, you want to say a few words to your folks from SFUSD?
Yeah, just one from our SFUSD kind of audience and others who are here. If we could just like give a really warm, gracious, like, thank you, gratitude for all just amazing time and insight and words of wisdom, and just for who you are, and also the work that you're producing is incredibly powerful and affirming. Thank you so much. I hope for folks who are here listening that you got some gems and some inspiration to continue to put engaging, relevant, justice-centered narratives in front of young people that will cause questions, maybe even more than answers, that will inspire our own students to think about their own identities and their place in the world, and hopefully hold up some mirrors and some windows and some skylights so folks can see, you know, the multitude of ways of being and the ways of knowing, and also what's happening in this world, and their place in it to change it. And so we think that this is a really amazing entry point. And I think the work that's being shared here is a way to do that. And so I hope that folks found this as engaging as I know we did. And I really also, I just want to really make sure that we give proper praise and props to the SFSU Comics Studies Department, who was instrumental in putting this panel together. So thank you so much. I cannot wait to check out more amazing things that your group is doing. It seems incredible. And for those of us in the audience who are able to make it next week to the in-person session that Nick is holding, which is basically like a part 2, making comics kind of in person, a workshop. Space was limited for that just because of capacity, but we hope if you want to send us a note on the feedback form for the SFUSD folks, we can think about, how to have another one or more like these in the future. So we're excited to get a chance to connect with you in person at State. But just as a final reminder to the SFUSD folks, please fill out that sign in just so we can also get your feedback on this and how we can have more events and more PDs that pique your interest and are kind of to the topics that you want to see reflected in your professional development. Once again, much gratitude to our panelists and the SFSU folks who put this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikhil.
You panelists.
Mari, Maya, Joel, and Joe, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your process, your wisdom. Thank you for creating wonderful art and helping get it in the hands of the students who need it so much. We hope we have an opportunity to work with you again in some capacity in the future. But in the meantime, we'll all be buying your books and reading them.
Yeah, thanks you guys. That was terrific.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more with you, but hopefully again soon. Thank you.
Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Y'all take care.
Much, everyone.
Luck
Good
on
night.
tour.
Oh, Mari, also, I just want to tell you, we were trying to order your books for all the teachers and like all your stuff is back ordered, or I don't know, like we're still trying to figure out how to get yours.
What books are you looking for?
I think our person at libraries like was trying multiple titles and was having difficulty.
Oh no, well, contact me and I could maybe get you in touch with certain people. I'm trying to figure out why certain books are out from like the distributor, but like I'm actually looking into some of that right now. But like send me
Okay, cool.
go to my website.
Thanks.
Bye.
Guys,
Good night.
thank you.
Nick,
All right, thanks, Joe. Hey, Joe.
hey, I'm gonna email you. I want to see if we can set up a time to talk a little bit about ADA work and building off of the stuff that you all are doing.
Great.
Particularly as
That'd
we
be
can
great.
move into doing some comics about Americans with disabilities for the Hidden Voices work. So.
Sounds good.
Oh, and Joe, do you